Well, thanks everyone for coming. So Greeshma and I just met, and we're both reporters, and both reporting on conflict. And Greeshma's reporting from east of India. I'm now currently in Mexico, and historically, I've reported prior to Mexico. I reported on the wars in Central Africa, and so maybe each of us can just speak about the different storms that we're introduce the storms that we're covering, and then we can have a dialogue.
India has been pretty much stormy for centuries, right? Considering our longest running conflict or storm is caste. So, in that sense, I think my work before Manipur, which is also around ethnic violence, is connected with the storm that India has denied, for the longest time. So when I started off as a journalist, I happened to be a lawyer. I practiced as a lawyer. When I started off as a journalist, I mostly started reporting from my own region. I am from Chennai, but my parents are from the Tulu region, which, as you all know, is in the coast of Karnataka, right? Mangalore, Kasargod up until Kundapur, which, as all of you know, is seen as an extremely communal place right now. It's seen as the bed of RSS in the south. It's seen as one of the strongholds of the south, RSS in the south. So I started off reporting there because it kind of was a reckoning for myself. And why is it that people who I know, including my own family, including my own folks, have started speaking a language which was unfamiliar to me as a child? I don't remember my family being communal when I was growing up. But as I saw them transition into the 2000s, 2014, 15, their language changed. And as a young person, it shocked me, but it also scared me in the sense that after 2002, many of us have grown up after 2002, after the demolition of Babri, after so many such incidents. Many of us as young children, as young people, have kind of tried to reckon with what's happening around us. And I was one of those persons just confused. So I started off in my own region, and in that region, I tried to understand and tell everybody around me, including my own people, why is it that we are speaking this way? And that story I said from like a 2-century perspective, like the story of how a region turned into this communal Hindus, though this region had nothing to do with Hinduism. So I did like an entire 60,000 words long form sort of a reportage. That's where I started off from. My journey is from there, and it is right now in Manipur, where, like all of you know, there has been a civil war in Manipur from the 3rd of May of 2023. For the longest time, many of us didn't speak about the violence till that video came out, which I think some of you would have seen, till a very, very gory video came out of Manipur. That video, in spite of what it was, where we saw 2 women being paraded naked by a big mob, did not stop the war. The war is still on. The violence hasn't ended in Manipur. So that's where I am at in terms of my work. I think Anjan can speak a bit about his work now.
Sure. So since I guess we're both from Chennai. From Chennai, I went to study in the US, and then from there I went to Congo. And so I'd graduated from university at 22. I also studied another profession. I was a mathematician. I studied mathematics after doing 1 year at IIT Madras. So I moved to the US, studied mathematics, and then left all of that. And at 22, I bought a one-way ticket to Kinshasa and Congo, because I had read in the New York Times, in the middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page, in a little article, that 4 million people had died in that war. And I didn't understand, very similar to what Greeshma's sort of talking about Manipur. At a global level, very similar dynamics are at play in the international media. This war in Congo, 4 million people had died. It doesn't get any coverage. It's like buried in the middle of the newspaper. It should be on the front page. It's the deadliest war in the world since World War II. At that time, every day, the estimated death toll was 1,000 people. And yet, it wasn't getting anywhere close to the international coverage that it would have had this war been taking place, say, in the West. And so, kind of troubled by this, curious about this, trying to understand why this wasn't making the news, also wanting to become a reporter and reporting on this situation. I moved to Kinshasa, stayed there for a year and a half, and began to cover the war in east of Congo. I found a job as a stringer for a freelance journalist for the Associated Press and the American news agency, and began to cover this country, which is half the size of Europe. It's all of Western Europe together, for the American news agencies and for the global audience. So I was 22, had no experience, and so I think this is also a symptom of no experience of journalism, also a symptom of the lack of importance that the international media gives to places like Congo. Because they're in Africa, it shows a bias in the international media. The kinds of stories that are allowed to make the news, the kinds of stories that reach us as readers, and the kinds of stories that, despite their huge scale and impact on millions of people's lives, don't get covered and don't get into the international media. So, yeah, I kind of, I ended up in Congo because I was paying my last bill at the university in the US, and the cashier happened to be from Congo. She was African, I could tell by her accent. So I asked her, where are you from? She said Zaire, which is the old name for Congo. I said, oh, I might go there. I want to go there and report from there. And she said, no, you stupid American kids, you don't know how to sign a check. I could steal all your money. You're going to get raped or killed if you go there. And then finally, I ended up staying with her family. I became friends with her, and she allowed me to stay with her family. She gave me their contact. So my first book is called Stringer. And about half the book, big chunk of the book, is about my life with this Congolese family in this pretty poor neighborhood, and trying to analyze the difference between the stories they tell each other, they hand down to their children, and the stories that I was reporting about the country to the world, and seeing the difference. And also trying to understand it, because I was trying to sell these stories to survive, right, to pay my rent. So from there, I moved to Rwanda. I taught a group of about a dozen journalists, Rwandan journalists, in a workshop. Kind of I lived in Rwanda for 5 years, but over the course of 2 years, I was teaching about a dozen journalists, and they were taken out by the government one by one as I was teaching them. So one was shot dead on the same day he criticized the president. Others were imprisoned, tortured. Others were threatened, had to flee the country. So that was my second book, which is called Bad News: Last Journalist in a Dictatorship. It tells the stories of these brave Rwandan journalists from whom I learned a lot about journalism. Third book, which I've published, is called Breakup, A Marriage in Wartime. It's about my reporting in the Central African Republic, just north of Congo. So I reported on that region for about 10 years. And I reported in the Central African Republic on the ethnic cleansing of Muslims from that country. So over the course of, 6 months, basically the entire Muslim population was cleansed and either killed or hiding. A few were hiding in some mosques. Most of them fled the country due to the enormous scale of the violence. And this story, all my books are sort of personal and political. And so the first book is coming of age. The second book is my relationship with these Rwandan journalists. And the third book is about my marriage and my divorce, and how this reporting contributed, how my marriage helped my reporting, and how the reporting contributed to my divorce. And so it's a story many frontline journalists and humanitarian workers have lived through, the impact of their work on their personal lives, but it's not described or written about that often. And now, just to complete, I'm sort of living in Mexico. I'm reporting on indigenous communities that are fighting to protect their land, their ecosystems. They're fighting against the government, Mexican government. They're fighting against international corporations. They're fighting against the cartels, some of the most violent and powerful criminal organizations in the world. And they're trying to defend their land. So one example is a little community of 1,000 people in the west of Mexico that I've reported on. A mining company wanted to take over their land and mine steel, iron, and gold from their land. The community said no, and suddenly the cartels began to attack them. And the community of 1,000 people has bought anti-aircraft guns, drones, and they're fighting a full-scale drone war against this cartel. And so the reporting I've done has been to talk about how, depict the struggle for their land and their freedom. also as a defense of the ecosystems that they are protecting. And many small indigenous communities around the world are protecting very precious, pristine ecosystems. And since in the last 10 years, roughly 2,000 environmental defenders have been killed around the world, 70% in Latin America. And the year I moved to Mexico in 2021, Mexico was the deadliest country for environmental defenders. So that's kind of, what took me to Mexico, the kinds of things that I'm reporting on now, and I'm working on another book about these defenders and what they mean to the global fight against climate change. Maybe I could ask you a question. So when you were speaking, I guess I had the question: what made you switch from law? Because you can have quite an impact as a lawyer on sort of protecting communities' rights. What made you switch to journalism? What made you see that you might have maybe more of an impact in journalism? I'm curious what made that switch and what took you to Manipur in the end?
Well, this is a question that I've been asked a lot, and I always say I don't know. But to sort of contextualize why I switched better, the criminal justice system in India is horrible. Like, getting rights or getting justice, the concept of justice itself is so flawed in the sense that I was just reading this book. I just finished reading this book called The Lucky Ones by Zara Chowdhury. You all should read it if you all can. It's about 2002, and she writes a memoir about how she doesn't want. She's from Gujarat. She lived as a 16-year-old in Gujarat during the 2002 violence, and she talks about how she won't have her. She won't leave this world with trauma as her collective memory, right? Because there's no justice. At the end of the day, there is nothing called justice for people who are from certain communities in India. You can call them whatever, lowered caste, marginalized, whatever you want to call it. So the concept of justice itself is highly flawed because our justice system is steeped in the same inequalities that we try to report on. It's casteist, it's right now very pro-state, it's Islamophobic, it's everything that it shouldn't be. So negotiating that justice system while trying to be a lawyer was very disillusioning for me because I was a criminal lawyer. I was mainly working with criminal law. I was working with under trial prisoners. I was working in cases where even to move a bail application, it would be so difficult. And once we get bail, somebody we are representing wouldn't be able to make that bail, even bring together $10,000 because that's the kind of background that they would be coming from. So we would also have to make that bail. Or they would be in jail for another 3 months or another 6 months. That's the kind of work it is to be like a civil rights lawyer in India. So it is, or even family law for that matter, like personal law, to go to court and to convince a judge that, you know what, this woman has been like brutalized, so give her like more than the $1,000 that you have decided as maintenance. All of these things can be like a little disillusioning for a young person, especially when I was also working with people's movements. A lot of the work that I was doing was with people's movements at that time where there would be atrocities around caste and it would be difficult for us to register an FIR. It would be difficult for us to document something that has happened at the scale that it did. One of the first times I went out as a journalist while I was a lawyer was when the violence happened in Una in Gujarat. I think all of you all are familiar, right? Where 4 Dalit men were tied up and beaten up in this small village called Una in Gujarat. And then after that, there was a lot that happened in Gujarat. There was violence for a month. Dalits in Gujarat sort of responded to this violence by going out, taking carcasses of dead cows, flinging it into government offices. And while I was seeing all this happen, which is revolutionary, imagine, like the violence in Gujarat was that these 4 men who were supposed to dispose a dead cow, these 4 Dalit men, this family basically, that was supposed to dispose a dead cow, were beaten up because under the suspicion that after disposing what's bad of that dead cow, they would eat the meat. They would eat beef. That is where the violence started in Mota Samadiyala. So I was there. I was practicing as a lawyer in Bangalore and I was sent by this YouTube channel to cover it because they thought I knew Hindi. But nobody speaks Hindi in Gujarat. That's a different thing. So when I went there, for close to a month, there was nobody reporting on that. You know, like I was seeing Dalits in Gujarat are a very small percentage, they're only 5.6-ish percent. They were responding to this violence by taking carcasses of dead cows, flinging it into government offices, saying, we will not dispose your dead animals anymore. And nobody was reporting it. For a month, nobody reported it. And then there was a march from Ahmedabad to Una. And that is the march that finally some outlets covered, right? And that's when I realized that stemming from the experience of that family and their experience with the criminal justice system there, because all those people who did that are right now out on bail. They are not in jail, or there was no reparations for what happened there. But I also realized that the problem was not just with the criminal justice system; it's also with journalism, which is so. I don't want to swear, but which is so screwed up in India, right? It is some of the violence, which is why I said caste is the longest running conflict in India, and it is the most unacknowledged one. For us to report something as something that happens every day is so difficult. It's so difficult for us, either as independent journalists, or I worked in a mainstream outlet as well. For us to report that while we are in a mainstream outlet is also very difficult. For us to convince our editors that, you know what, this is something that we want to report on. And what would that be? Death, violence, rape, whatever you want to call it. So from Gujarat, I understood that reportage in India is so biased, so flawed, dominated by people who are like from elite, dominant caste communities, that somehow I thought at that time that, okay, maybe in journalism, I was under the illusion that if we fight, we can report. We will be able to report. And I went into a mainstream outlet. It was very complicated to report there as well, which is why I eventually switched to being an independent journalist. But again, it's not easy. It's not easy at all, like consistently reporting on something like Manipur, where even international journals, international agencies do not understand what it is, right? Because India has a lot of these problems which national outlets themselves don't want to understand. So even Indians sitting in international agencies want to tell you stuff like, you know what, you have to be neutral. You're looking at violence, and then the first thing that they tell you is you have to be neutral when you're reporting, where you're seeing one community being ethnically cleansed, and you're told to be neutral. So these problems are deep-rooted in journalism and in the criminal justice system, but I just thought maybe I can negotiate these problems better as a journalist. Yeah. That is why I switched. But if I'm able to negotiate them better, I'm not sure. But maybe, you can tell us about your experience about how it was for you to negotiate the same issue that I said of a community completely not represented on media, and how it is that you were able to negotiate that space in journalism.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's kind of the space that I've been working in for the last 20 years. So whether it's the Congo War or the Central African Republic, when I went to the Central African Republic and I asked editors to send me there, they asked me which Central African Republic, so they didn't know that it was a country. It's just off the radar, off the map. And so the challenge that excites me, that I've been working on for the last 20 years, is trying to get some of these marginalized stories into the mainstream conversation. How do I do that? I convince the editors of mainstream media publications, whether it's the BBC or the New York Times or Caravan magazine, we both published, or which is mostly in India, but still has some reach, at least in the diaspora abroad. Or I gave a TED talk last year. I gave a TED talk on their main stage, about my reporting in Mexico. So to convince a curator at TED who's focused largely on AI or technology and the issues that are present in the American consciousness or the Western consciousness, to convince them that indigenous communities in Mexico are important, is the challenge that excites me. And in this specific case, what happened was I pitched a talk to TED. The curator came to me and said, we're not convinced. Why should we represent this issue? Why should you be the one speaking about it? And kind of the way that I guess that I pitched the talk a little bit was many of these indigenous communities, they're on the front lines, they're under fire. For me, they're heroes, and they're engaged in a very heroic battle against very powerful forces, and they're very small. It's like David versus Goliath. But nobody's telling their story, and you may not want necessarily. The analogy that I made was, it's very similar in my mind to the story of, say, the 300 Spartans who, fought in Greece, and you had Herodotus who wrote their story, and that story is still being told today. And it took a messenger, it took someone neutral, took someone outside the war itself to see these fighters and warriors for who they are and what the battle that they're fighting, and for that story to then echo through time. And so the way I managed to convince the curator was that I can be that messenger. I've gone into those battles. Many of these fighters, we don't know if they're going to be alive tomorrow or in a month or 3 months. That's the nature of their battle. And that's the nature of the battle that they've chosen. They've chosen to put their bodies on the front lines to fight for these ecosystems. My job is to go in to those places, very dangerous places, but to get out alive and get out with those stories and not stay there so long that I myself might be killed. But I can come out, capture those stories and tell them so that their lives and their struggle is in a sense, echoes or is immortalized in a certain way. And that storytelling is a function that journalism can perform. And that's what frankly gives me hope, because I face many of the challenges that you're facing. It's hard to get these stories published. No one wants to tell them. So I try to find ways in which, journalism can help these at least their deaths and their struggles should not be in vain, and that the stories can continue to be told and inspire future generations, people outside as well, to take action for the causes that they're fighting for, which are very noble causes in my opinion. I don't know if you feel something similar in your journalism, with
Well,
that
I'm just
source of
thinking
hope.
of actually, like, my reportage on Manipur, it's not something that I wanted to do, honestly, because I'm from Tamil Nadu and I'm pretty focused on trying to tell stories from the south, because I feel like every state in the south has a different story to tell. So even to use a term like the south, which North Indian media, which Delhi media does, is extremely problematic. And I honestly thought that uh, the reason why we are not understood well is because of this, right? Very few people want to send reporters to the south. The bureaus that exist in southern cities or southern towns, they are not maybe well understood in the north. So when I started off, which is why I started from my region, Tulu region, I was working for a national outlet, but I told them this is what I want to do, right? But the reason why I say this is, when the violence in Manipur started on the 3rd of May, there was no news till the end of May. We were all busy talking about Karnataka elections. And maybe if some of the reporters from that region would have reported on what's happening there, it wouldn't have been required for me to go all the way to Manipur, because honestly, I want to only report from the south. This is my thing. I had decided this in my head. But I want to tell the story of Makepeace Sitlo, one of the best journalists from the Northeast. She's from Manipur herself, but because she belongs to the Kukizo community, that is the target of the Manipur violence, she can't even go back to Manipur. She can't land in Imphal. So the capital of Manipur, which is Imphal, is no longer an area or a city where the Kukizo people can go. They were cleansed out of Imphal, and she can't land in Imphal. If she has to go to Manipur or her district, she'll have to fly from Delhi to Guwahati, Guwahati to Aizawl, and then take a 36-hour journey through road for her to even go to Manipur. So somebody like her, who could have easily reported on this, who could have been like the front runner in reporting on Manipur, couldn't even report. I mean, she understands the region much better than anybody else. She has done reportage from different regions of the Northeast for a while. She is also like tribal, which is majority of the Northeast, and yet she couldn't report from there. And the state and the government did nothing to facilitate free passage for her as a journalist. So the story of how it is that I wish I wasn't the one doing journalism in this region, because I feel like she would have done it much better than me. I'm still not from that region. I'm trying to do my best in kind of understanding the shortcomings of not being, in kind of filling the gaps of not being from there. But I still feel like the flaws that are there in the Indian state right now, in the Indian government right now, of sort of completely invisibilizing communities like the Kukizo community and their audial. And instead, the whole violence of Manipur, it started from this language of who is illegal, right? This is something that you can draw from what's happening in the US right now, what maybe a lot of Mexicans face, what different communities across the world face, how that language kind of turned an award-winning journalist from Manipur, Makepeace, who has won awards not just in India but also elsewhere in the world, how the term of illegal was also accorded to her, you know, and stopping her reportage from the region that she belongs from. So this is a question that we also have to ask. This is something that's not being spoken about enough. I feel like, again, the challenge of reporting from Manipur, about Manipur, was with journalists from the Northeast. There are very well-established journalists there, but very few of them rose to this challenge. Again, because there was so much of repression. East Mojo, which is a Guwahati-run, Northeast-based news outlet, which was there on the ground within the first few days, faced so much repression from the BJP government in Assam that they had to stop. The journalists who went to report had to go into hiding. So I feel like the challenge is here, and that's where the fear that Indian journalistic agencies have. Fear, or many of them are also pro-state. That's a different thing. Outlets like the Caravan are very few, and the cover story for the Caravan I did at that time, and the Caravan was the only one that was willing to, let me write. But so it's all connected, On one side, there is this violence that is being hidden in plain sight, and the way that violence comes out is through Twitter. And while that happens, all agencies are suddenly interested. And yet, in spite of the reporting that happens after, which is like very touch and go kind of reporting for 2 weeks, we are still continuing with the war, and it's in the second year. So there is an active system right now that is silencing violence that happens across India in different forms, be it what is happening in Manipur, be it what is happening in different pockets, different forms of caste violence in different pockets spread across India, be it the violence that Muslims are facing. And I don't know how it is that we can really, respond to this in India itself, considering this is where I've worked, because there is a fatigue also that most journalists are facing. The fatigue which is connected with the disinterest, the absolute disinterest that most agencies have in reporting on these different problems in the right way. And being consistently interested as editors in reporting India and not bowing down to the pressure that the central government is kind of mounting over and over. Like even agencies, really good agencies which would have reported well, let's say a decade back, are crumbling to that pressure. In my own copies, I was told that, listen, we can't take this language. From agencies that would otherwise report very well from rest of the world, wouldn't do that here. Like Vice, for instance, one example, which does these amazing documentaries from South America. They have amazing documentaries as well, right? It's a very small example. They do different kind of stuff across the world, but they couldn't really do that in India, In India, the only thing that they spoke about is the LGBTQ community and what it is that means. That was the easiest thing that they could do, and that's all they did. And HuffPost India shut down. They had to shut down. So the pushback that international agencies receive in India and how they kind of just comply, even Amazon, Netflix, all of these agencies, is something that is also true. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about why is it that international agencies buckle to the Indian government?
So I guess the solution that I found to the same problem that I faced in, say, Congo or Mexico, the way I solved it was to try and report on these issues in the International New York Times or in The Guardian or in the BBC. International media that had bureaus abroad that weren't subject to the, say, local government's pressures, in your case, Indian government, in my case, Mexican government, and to raise the issue, raise the profiles of these, journalists, defenders, communities abroad, and that made it less convenient or more difficult for the Mexican government to ignore them as they had been, because suddenly the profile, say, in the equivalent, what I've done is Makepeace in Manipur. I've I've done a profile of the equivalent person or community in international media, a Mexican community. And suddenly the Mexican government and Mexican president could not ignore that community, could not pretend there's no drone war happening here. We're just going to turn a blind eye to this. And so that's been kind of my solution to, because the foreign media has more sort of leverage, more freedom. But on the other hand, obviously, they're not going to be interested in a piece consistently, like you were saying. They're not going to publish a piece every month, but they'll publish one big piece one year, and then that puts some pressure on the Mexican government or Congolese government or whatever it is. So that's kind of how I've tried to solve this problem. I think ultimately, I don't know what you feel. I think ultimately, what we'll need is global South media. I think this is the problem in the international media, that there's biases, there's racism, there's in India you've mentioned casteism, that allows some stories to be told and others not to be told. And I think as the global South, as coming from India or Nigeria or South Africa, Kenya, China, I think my own view is that we have to stop complaining about the Western media and their biases, which will naturally exist and do exist, and that it's time to push our own indigenous media to cover the world and cover, say, Indian media to cover, Bangladesh, and Bangladeshi media to cover India. Maybe Bangladesh isn't the best example, but to cover our neighbors in a way that, with empathy and valuing people's lives in a way that Western media just won't, and stop complaining.
And so, I mean, even the Indian media won't. Can you imagine the Indian media sitting next to Burma, sitting next to Myanmar, and has not. We are literally next to a country which is in the middle of a war, which is in the borders of India and the Northeast. Across the borders, the ones who are running this Myanmar on the other side of the Indian border on the Northeast are rebel groups. Ethnic groups have occupied all of the borders which are on the Myanmar side, but you won't see a lot of reportage about that in Indian media, because the only reportage about that in the Indian media would be what the junta is saying, because the Indian government has a pro-junta stance, while the Indian government is also negotiating with these rebel groups. But the Indian media, I mean, it doesn't even send out reporters here. What will send reporters there, right? But again, when we talk about international agencies and their biases, right? Like, you will see a lot of reports, let's say of Al Jazeera or the New York Times from Myanmar. But the stand that the New York Times took, let's say, in Palestine or in Gaza, they did better stories from Myanmar than in Palestine, though they had like absolutely great access. It was very thrilling for journalists, for white people from New York to come to Myanmar and do like all these stories of these guerrilla fighters and all of that. But what did they do about Palestine, right? And similarly, is there biases when they come to India as well? That kind of stems from Indians right now are either Indians or Indian origin Americans are spread across media agencies, international media agencies as well. So I have felt like at times negotiating with these people and convincing them about what is happening in India is also difficult. It has been difficult for us to tell them that, you know what, this is what is happening, or you can't let brownness or whatever that term is define what you face in America, kind of deny the complexities of the different identities in India. This has been a challenge as well. And on your thing about covering surrounding countries, well, be it Pakistan, be it Bhutan, be it Nepal, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, we have failed. Indian agencies have actively failed, because what has happened in Sri Lanka and how we covered it and the Tamil position on it, right? How the national media absolutely failed while Tamil Nadu was taking a different line altogether. So I feel like things haven't changed much. It's remained as complicated as ever for Indian agencies, considering most of them are pro-state right now, for them to even want to be empathetic towards our neighbors. But I think we should move to questions. It's 1:45.
I guess I just add to that. Yeah, I just add to that. I guess, yes, national media will have blind spots. India won't cover many things its own country, which is based on national interest, national policy. the New York Times, New Yorker, they don't cover Native American affairs. It's very inconvenient to their national mythology and national stories. But they do cover some parts of the world relatively well. They won't cover Israel and Gaza so in an unbiased way because they have national political interests there. But other regions, they might do a better job. So it's actually finding, no media is going to not have blind spots, but finding a foreign media that isn't maybe partisan in a certain conflict, you might have more luck there. And ultimately, Indian media, if it goes global, or Nigerian media, for example, will have biases.
Indian media did go global. A lot of journalists from India, from Network 18 and different outlets, were covering Gaza when, I mean, they were in Israel, not Gaza, they were in Israel, but they didn't come to Manipur. A bunch of them, you know, and they're like, we are going international. And they were, when the war started there, they were there talking all kinds of, taking a pro-Israel position, obviously, in lines with what the Indian government does. None of them came to Manipur, so that is also something.
But I guess two examples are, yesterday I was on a panel with Stanley Johnny, who's the foreign affairs editor at the Hindu. And so his book on the Israel-Gaza conflict and what's happening there takes a very global South perspective, and it's apparently selling well. People, there's appetite for that story, which is very different from the global North story. The other example is the day I showed up here 2 days ago. That evening, there's a war, there's an invasion happening in Congo. Rwanda's invading Congo. The last time this happened in 96 and 98, all of Congo was taken over. It led to Africa's Great War. That's what sparked the war that has now killed 6 million people. So it's a big deal. Everybody's worried that this new invasion by Rwanda might spark a similar conflict. And I was very pleased that a Nigerian TV channel reached out to me, and I did a TV sort of intervention on a panel that night for a Nigerian channel. So Nigeria is taking an active interest in Congo. They did allow me to speak freely. They did take an interest in the actual geopolitical dynamics over there. And I thought that's a kind of connection, South-South connection, that starts to needs to start to happen to begin to, so that populations start to take notice and start to pay attention to their neighbors. And then naturally that feeds into, hopefully, political solutions. So that's my, two sparks or points of hope. But yeah, any questions?
How will you, as journalist, distinguish between national interest and interest of nationalism while reporting? Because there are certain areas of national interest which we have to protect always. But there are interests of nationalism which always coming to presently very clearly. We are facing all these things. How you will draw a fine balance between these two in the troubled areas or troubled times? That's my question.
Would you want to give an example, sir, of what you think is national, just for me to understand where the question is coming from? Like, if area of national interest,
I mean,
if you were to define.
National interest means the idea of India is for us a national interest, of thing of national interest. But there are interests of nationalism where the nationalism is being projected as the only thing that should survive. That is my general idea of pointing it to you. How in the different areas, how will you view it and report from your area?
Do we want to take a few questions if there are?
Oh.
And then we can. Oh, she also has a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead and
we can
pass the mic.
both, yeah.
No, what I wanted to ask is, as we all know, in the World Press Freedom Index, Indian media has dropped to a very embarrassing level right now. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. And as we all know, I don't want to take any names, but Indian media has dropped to the level that we are reporting what color sari our minister was wearing in a particular meeting. So that is the level we are at right now. So what is the future of Indian media? Do we have a future?
My question to you is, as a journalist, how do you counter the fake narratives that is being played around now?
Nationalism, national interest. Right now, nationalism in India is Hindu nationalism. That's what is the most dominant and that's what has flavor that sort of everybody talks about. It's turned into that. But that doesn't mean that's the nationalism that everybody ascribes to or everybody talks to. How is it that we negotiate this emerging or this nationalism that is being centered by the government, and how do we respond to it saying, this is what defines nationalism for me or national interest for me, is very crucial. Not just as journalists, but as individuals. Because I feel like that is where we are at right now, where we have to clearly define as individuals, as persons, forget about being journalists, lawyers, whatever, what our nationalism is. We are at that juncture. Let's not kid ourselves. We are at that juncture where we have to be clear about who this India represents and what India represents, right? Because it's being reduced. People are saying this in the constitution has to be removed. People are saying we will remove it. People are saying what is this term? Why is this term even there? We don't ascribe to secularism. These are the dominant narratives that are being discussed on mainstream media almost every day. So in this kind of a space, even having an opinion that, you know what, this is not an important conversation, or this is not something that we need to think so much about, is problematic. So I feel like we are at a juncture where we have to be very clear about where we come from. That's as far as that question is concerned. I'll answer the three and then you can take a go at it. Okay? Yeah. The future of journalism, I'm as clueless as you. I'm absolutely clueless, but because a lot of people say that irrespective of what it is, we will push back and all of that, but the state of journalism has always been bad. It's always been horrible. To say that journalism was better a few years back or a few decades back is a lie. Journalism in India has never spoken for the people. This is the truth. There have been journalists, there have been individuals who tried to do it, but how is it that in a country where anti-reservation protests were happening in the 90s, 90s when I was a kid, when I was just born, is when the Mandal Commission protests were happening, or people were coming out and saying, reservation, affirmative action, we are against it. How is it from that point up until 2016 when Rohit Vemula died, till that point, nobody, even now, people don't understand what the reality of caste is. Where is the gap? Isn't it because we are not right now for people to get up and say that caste doesn't exist, caste is like a myth. What caste? For people to speak like this, where is the gap? Haven't academics been talking about it? Haven't journalists been reporting about it when caste violence happens almost every day? Not almost, it happens every day. Where is the gap? So journalism has always been bad, but things have gotten better because there is something called the social media, which is also a bane, which is connected to the next question. It's because of the coming of an open platform that certain people started putting out their experiences by themselves. That's what kind of pushed editors of national mainstream media channels to say that, you know what, to be safe, we have to write about caste. That's the only reason why they started talking about caste. It's not because, it came from this thing that we have to center this conversation. So that's where it came from. Very young people, like your own MP, Shashi Tharoor, has written this piece about how he responded to this 18-year-old. I don't know whether you all are familiar about this, but he wrote a book saying, Why I'm a Hindu. And this 18-year-old who had this, she was studying in Lady Shriram or something. She had this handle called Rohit's Comrade. And she wrote to him on Twitter saying, you can be proud of being a Hindu, but as a scheduled caste woman, I can't say the same. And he responded to that and he said that now I understand and now I change my position. And this she did as an 18-year-old with a Twitter handle. She works in the services now, but I'm just saying, if not for social media, it would be horrible, for us to respond to the challenges that India is facing. But that is also connected to your question, because social media is the center of disinformation. When I was reporting from Manipur, I would be on the ground. I would see villages being burnt down. By the time I would come out, because as an independent journalist, you can't first of all, you have to find an outlet where you can write your story, right? So it would take me at least a week to write my story. By the time I come out and put out my report, which is eyewitness account of what has happened, there would be something else floating on social media, which would also be reported on as the truth, And as soon as I put this out, there would be counter narratives, there would be disinformation, which is not only stemming from social media, which is stemming from the state, which would spread on social media. So it's a huge challenge for us to actually take this on, because at least for an independent journalist, it's extremely difficult. If agencies with bigger bureaus, with bigger teams can actively combat this kind of a challenge, it would be better, but it is enormous. I can only tell you how big it is from the context of Manipur, because we face this every day. When we put out reports, we only get slut shamed on social media. We are told that we are lying. where it's like the truth that we put out as our reports are told is not the truth. And there is a parallel reality that is floated by the state and supported by handles with enormous reach that is supposed to be the truth. Then how do you kind of combat this is something that we're dealing on an everyday basis. But yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult.
So thanks. Yeah, I guess I would echo some of Greeshma's points there. And I guess your questions are about national interests and nationalism. My guiding principle is I hold power accountable when that power is abused. So there can be national interests, individual interests, corporate interests, whatever interests, but there are legal frameworks for how these interests can be played out in the public sphere. When these interests are abused, when a corporation hires a cartel or allies itself with a criminal cartel to attack a village, that is abuse of power. When a state harasses or doesn't provide protection to journalists, that's an abuse of power. So those instances are where I focus my efforts on. And well, it doesn't matter who's committing the abuse of power, the more powerful, the better. That's a bigger target. And so that's my job as a journalist, fourth pillar of democracy, to hold the executive and the other three branches to some degree accountable. And so that's kind of been my... I'm not against national interests, not against nationalism even. People can hold their opinions and governments can promote their interests. But when that power is abused, that's where I feel that journalists have to step in. So that's kind of my guiding principle wherever I am. I guess the other two questions, where is journalism heading and how do you counter disinformation? I agree with Greeshma there that, journalism has been in a bad state for a long time, especially independent journalists. Now the crisis is even graver. There's pay rates have plummeted. There's threats from legal teams, from corporations. There's threats from criminal groups, from dictatorships. There's huge amounts of pressure, especially on individuals who have very little institutional support and very little community. The way I'm trying to solve this is by getting involved in a couple of initiatives, starting a couple of initiatives to support freelance independent journalists, creating a news platform. I'm involved in an initiative now to create a news platform. These initiatives are not going to be perfect. Every action will be political, and I recognize that there will be limitations to what I can do. But I guess personally, I'm a bit tired of complaining of the problems, and I want to. That's why I got into journalism. I went to Congo to put my feet on the ground there to understand what's happening and to maybe raise my voice a little bit to the extent that I could about what's happening there. Believing, like Greeshma, maybe naively or idealistically, that this will produce some solution. Now I see that the problems are systemic in the media. So my instinct is the same, to step in and see if I can start something and I can build something that will try and solve these problems. And I'm trying to, I have more community now, more supporters than I did 20 years ago as a 22-year-old. So I'm trying to bring together a community and see if I can try to solve these problems. I'm not sure. After my TED talk, for example, a couple of philanthropists came up to me and they asked me, how can we scale up your work? How can we create a foundation to promote journalists, freelance support and promote the work of freelance journalists around the world? So these are some of the questions I'm thinking about and trying to craft solutions to create a system of fellowships and prizes and create support networks in the community. It's taken me 20 years to even know that international journalism organizations have funds to provide for my therapist or mental health support for reporters such as like me, who many of whom do end up with PTSD and other things from the work in conflict zones. I didn't know this until a few years ago, that they actually have funds to support this kind of stuff. So if I can open up my networks to younger reporters, other reporters, and if I can mobilize my friends and community to do the same, maybe we can create support, financial support, community, to help each other in a very difficult space, as Greeshma has been saying. It's very, very difficult. So, and amplify our voices to counter that kind of disinformation. It's always going to be there. But can we effectively come together as a community? I'll just end with to your question. There's a Congolese singer called Kofi Olomide, who had, in one of his songs, he had this line. He said, truth always takes the elevator. Lies always take the elevator. Truth takes the stairs, but it gets there eventually. So that's kind of some of the things that,